It's an honor to be between two Canadians who have, in their different ways, informed and animated public debates of vital public policy concern in this country. And it's going to be fairly straightforward. It will begin with Ezra's proposition that the oil sands are the most ethical source of oil on Earth, and development of the tar sands, the oil sands, is in Canadians' national interest, in Canada's national interest. And we'll begin with an opening statement from Ezra. Elizabeth will respond in kind. There will be a short exchange between them in which they may want to interrogate one another the tiniest bit. And I may participate in that just a little. And there will be a question and answer session for the final 20 minutes. So, Ezra, why don't you lead off?
Will do. Thanks, Fred, for convening things, and thanks, Terry, for moderating. The first thing I did when I started to write the book called Ethical Oil is I looked up the word tar in the dictionary because I didn't know. Are they oil sands? Are they tar sands? Which is which? And I discovered that tar comes from pine trees, or pine roots to be more precise, and it was used by the British Navy to waterproof their ships in the past. There is another kind of tar. It comes from coal. It's called coal tar, and that's sort of what tar is. It's from pine trees or from coal. What is found in northern Alberta is there's no tar there. There's no pine trees and no coal in the sand. It's oil mixed with clay and sand and water. And if you want to be technical, it's called bitumen. There's no tar in the tar sands. I did some history also. I looked at the names of the companies. Going back 80, 90 years, even when it was very experimental, it was always called bitumen or oil sands. So when someone says tar sands, what's going on? Well, maybe they didn't know. I didn't know a year ago when I started writing the book. But maybe they're just trying to stretch things just a little bit, just to make them sound a little dirtier, a little messier, a little more toxic, a little more hostile than they are. So I think it's like a poker tell. If someone says tar sands, you sort of know maybe someone's stretching things. But let's get to my 4 arguments of why I think Canada's oil sands are the most ethical source of oil in the world. I looked at the list of countries where oil comes from. The top 10 countries ranked by reserves. That's not just a good snapshot of where oil is coming from today, but where it's going to come from in 5 or 10 or 20 years. And I don't know what God was thinking when he was handing out oil, but he gave it to the world's bastards. Let's be frank. I mean, the number one country is Saudi Arabia, a misogynistic theocracy where women are forced to go outside in one-woman funeral shrouds and, aren't allowed to vote, and minorities are treated poorly, the source of terrorism. I mean, these are the kind of people with oil. Iran, Russia, the only liberal democracy on the list is us. Iraq's on the top 10 list, but they're a wobbly democracy. I'm rooting for them. But Russia is not a liberal democracy, and the rest are awful, awful people. And so I guess to be morally serious about oil, we have to do 2 things. We have to recognize that oil demand is going to increase, no matter what we do, whether we like it or not. For the first time ever last year, more cars were bought in China than were bought in the United States, 13.6 million. They all want to be 2-car families. Same in India. And that is where all the growth in daily oil demand is going to come from. Even if we Canadians were to shut everything down, world demand is going to grow. And the second thing we have to realize, and that's whether you like it or not. I mean, maybe you're anti-industrialist, maybe you're anti-oil, but the fact is, demand's going to grow. And then the second fact is, there is no fantasy science fiction alternative that works. If you ask Greenpeace or other environmental activists, what would you rather have us use besides oil? After making a few jokes about we should walk in a big country, a cold country, then when you ask them to get serious, they say, well, in 30 or 40 years, we'll have solar powered this, or the Chevy Volt, one of these days it'll work. Well, when that happens, when we come up with a real alternative to oil, let me know. But 300 million Americans are going to fill up their cars with gasoline this week. And either they're buying it from Canada or they're buying it from Saudi Arabia. We're now the number 1 source of oil in terms of imports to the United States, 1.4 million barrels a day from the oil sands. We knocked the Saudis out of top spot. They were number 1 until about 6 years ago. It's because of the oil sands that we've displaced the Saudis. If we were to shut down the oil sands, again, do you think Americans wouldn't drive their car for a minute? No, the Saudi ambassador would be right there to meet the shortfall, get his market share back. But I'm here to say it's not just reality that the oil sands are going to be important. It's also in the interests of true liberals, true progressives. Here are 4 liberal values that I think honestly reflect the best of liberalism. Number 1, environmentalism. Concern about real pollution and carbon dioxide. Now, when I was a kid, carbon dioxide, I learned about it in photosynthesis as plant food. But today we're told it's a pollutant. Now, instead of trying to argue with my friends on the left that it's not a pollutant, I accept, just for the purposes of the debate, that carbon dioxide is dangerous. And I can prove to you, and I will in this debate, the Canadian oil sands oil has a lower carbon footprint than most other sources, many other sources of oil in the United States, including Nigerian, Venezuelan, Iraqi, and even California oil. So environmentalism, that's clearly a liberal value. But what else? That's not the only thing liberals care about. Of course not. I mean, the word Greenpeace, what's the second half of that peace? Liberals truly care about peace. I mean, the great thing about being liberal, there's so many great chants. Increase the peace. Does your oil increase the peace? Well, why, yes, ours does. Thanks for asking. We Canadians are the folks who invented peacekeeping. The Saudis invented 9/11. 15 out of 19 terrorists came from there. Iran is building a nuclear bomb with their profits. Venezuela is threatening its neighbors. Russia invaded Georgia using its oil profits. We're the only guys who use oil money for peace, not war or conflict or terrorism. But that's not all liberals care about. True liberals care about what they would call economic justice, or what others might call a fair wage for the working man. That's the whole labor union movement, respecting the working man. Well, in Fort McMurray, how many minutes do I have? Well, I'll be quicker. The highest paid city in Canada, and the most generous according to the United Way. Drive a truck, you'll get $100,000. Compare that to Saudi Arabia, that uses migrant laborers, treats them poorly. Nigeria, where all the money's stolen, $366 billion stolen and embezzled by their government. And the final test is human rights. This is a liberal value. How do we treat women, gays, aboriginals? Compare that to how they treat gays in Iran. There are none, according to Ahmadinejad. And he's right, because if they find them, they kill them. We're the fair trade coffee of the world's oil industry, and don't you forget it.
Thanks. And thanks to Fred, and thanks to Terry and Ezra for this, what I hope will be more edifying than merely energizing. I'd like to actually have us talk about the issues. And for me, what Ezra has constructed is a non-issue, because, frankly, whether Canada is a nice country and nicer than the others doesn't really affect the big question we should be asking. Are we managing the tar sands in a way that is sensible? Are we developing them in a way that is of the benefit to the Canadian economy? And are we pulling our weight globally on the environment? And, frankly, it really doesn't seem to me to be a good start in terms of our foreign relations to refer to one of our NAFTA partners, Mexico, as a country of awful, awful, awful people, as Ezra just did. Mexico is one of the top 10 oil producers of the world. It is also a democracy. But frankly, if we were to ask ourselves, is Canada a better place to live? Do we have better human rights? Of course we do. Than any of the countries that Ezra has concentrated on, Saudi Arabia or the Sudan. There's no question about it. Or Nigeria, where General Abacha stole the wealth. But let's look at the multinationals that are developing in the tar sands. They're the very same companies that exploited Nigeria's Agoni fields in Shell oil, or BP developing in Myanmar, or Burma, as I'd rather call it. So if we were to look at this, we'd say the oil business is a dirty business. It's dirty globally. But what do we do in Canada about our resources? Because this is a Canadian question. So looking at other countries, we don't say, gee, everything's so much worse in other countries. You know, we could really do a good job with ethical child labor. We'd feed them much better and make sure they go to get tutors. It's really an irrelevant question between Canada and other countries around the world. So where I would start is, this is really a question that's about energy. Do we have a sensible energy strategy in this country? It's about economy. Does the current strategy for development of the oil sands actually help our economy as it should? It's also about climate policy. Are we as a nation undermining global progress for emissions reductions in order to protect just one part of our economy? Let me just get out of the way some context setting, because sometimes the opposition to the oil sands is made as an issue. It's either all or nothing. You either want the tar sands to be developed, or you want nothing at all. Let's be clear about this. As the leader of the Green Party of Canada, we've never called to shut down the 1.3 million barrels of oil currently being produced. We do think we've got to change the way we're handling this going forward. We have very strong concerns about the lack of environmental regulation, the lax regulation, and the way the money is handled. But let's keep the tar sands in a context. What do they mean to the world in terms of greenhouse gases? Is it, for instance, more or less important than coal-fired power plants? It's far more important to shut down coal-fired power plants and move away from coal than it is to focus on the tar sands. How are the tar sands rated against, say, fossil fuel subsidies globally? It's far more important to get the world governments to shut down fossil fuel subsidies globally than just to look at the tar sands. So I wanted that context setting because it's easy to set up a straw man on these kinds of things. Quickly getting back to some of the points. I'm surprised that in this entire book on ethical oil, as Ezra Levant demonizes sources of oil like Nigeria and Venezuela, fails to mention that 54% of the oil Canadians use come from those sources. Because we don't have a national energy strategy, we have an export strategy. It's also about our economy. We failed to note that the approach that Peter Lougheed would have used and set in place was abandoned by Ralph Klein. We've had a pell-mell development. And what that's meant for the Canadian economy, I first read about it in the report to Canada from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development several years ago, warning that Canada's economy was becoming skewed and less secure because of Dutch disease. I raised it in the leaders' debates. I bet most Canadians watching the leaders' debate didn't know why I was worrying about Dutch disease or what it was. I thought Mr. Harper might know because he allegedly studied economics. What we see happening in our country is that we have, because of the way the tar sands are being developed, we've allowed our dollar to become pegged with the value of a barrel of oil. A petrodollar means that our currency is tied to that. It's driven up the value of our dollar, which has cost hundreds of thousands of jobs in manufacturing. There's a whole-scale structural change happening to our economy that, according to not just the OECD, but Canadian economists and a parliamentary committee, has actually weakened our economy, made us less productive. It may be good for one part of our economy, but it hasn't served the nation as a whole, but it could. Lastly, what about climate policy? What sense does it make to be focusing on the tar sands and not looking at the whole energy picture? Well, I do disagree with Ezra on this. Right now in Canada, we waste more than half the energy we use. There's loads of scope to improve the energy efficiency, the productivity of energy use that would cut in half our demand simply by plugging the holes. On top of that, new energy sources are coming along. But let's look at what we do with subsidies. Even though Canada signed on to the G20 commitment to remove fossil fuel subsidies, as recently as the G20 in South Korea, Canada pushed for language that said removing subsidies could be timed to different domestic circumstances. In other words, the almost $3 billion a year that taxpayers in this country give to the development of the Athabasca oil sands will be staying in place because our government doesn't want to live up to its commitments. And cutting fossil fuel subsidies is more important than any other aspect of this issue. Thank you.
I have debated Elizabeth 2 or 3 times, a couple times about the oil sands. And Elizabeth, I have to say your position on the oil sands seems to me to be getting vaguer. I mean, we first debated on Roy Green's show, and he asked you, do you think the oil sands are a good thing or a bad thing? He tried to make it a very blunt question. I obviously said it was a good thing. You wouldn't agree to that, but you sound a little different now. You don't want to shut it down. You want to tweak things like subsidies. I say get rid of them. You want to talk about how we handle the funds and the revenues. Hey, sure, that's all reasonable debates. I agree if the question is, should we compare ourselves against the worst people in the world, or should we be self-critical and always improve? Over the last 20 years, the amount of CO2 per barrel in the oil sands oil has fallen by 38%. That is, we're 38% more efficient today than we were in 1990. I can hardly wait to see where we get to be in 20 years. I'm not opposed to any of these things. I'm not defending any particular oil company, and some oil companies behave very poorly in other parts of the world. But that's all my point, is because if we were to shut down the oil sands or slow it down, I think the oil sands should be doubled, tripled in production. Because every barrel we produce is one barrel that's not being sold by Saudis or Iranian Ayatollahs or Hugo Chavez. So what I'm missing from you, Elizabeth, is a firm statement if you think this is a good thing or a bad thing. I think you've gotten softer on the issue. I don't think you're opposing it as vigorously as you do when we first debated on Roy Green.
Perhaps
and I'll stop there and let you answer. Why don't you jump in? I mean,
right. I thought you were done. Sorry.
Okay, I'd love to hear.
I promise you I'm not getting softer and we don't change our position. What we've said all along is that we oppose any further development in the tar sands or the oil sands if you prefer. I think historically they were called tar sands. We oppose any further development. We want a moratorium until we can reduce the amount of water used per barrel of oil produced, till we can do a much better job figuring out why we are wasting so much natural gas, a really good, clean burning, useful fossil fuel. We're using it up to produce a much more dirty fossil fuel. We ought to look at those issues and figure out how we do it better. We need to tighten the environmental regulations, and frankly, we need to put in place some carbon pricing. The OECD, the most recent report, I haven't mentioned them yet, but the International Energy Agency report, World Energy Outlook, which came out a couple days ago, calls for governments around the world to end fossil fuel subsidies and to put in place carbon pricing as a mechanism to keep oil supply and demand in something like a reasonably safe economic formula going forward while reducing greenhouse gases. We are very firm on this. We're very clear on this. And I don't know how you could, I mean, I'm certainly a reasonable person, so I appreciate you've noticed that. But I haven't changed my position.
Has anyone heard of the Chicago Climate Exchange? Anybody? Yeah, about 10 hands. I went and I checked out the spot price for a ton of carbon dioxide. Anyone want to guess? Just shout it out. How much do you think a ton of carbon goes for? Elizabeth, you know?
It's gone down. It was $15 a ton. It had dropped last I looked.
I checked 2 days ago. It was 5 cents. 5 cents a ton. So the entire oil sands a year emits about 30 to 35 megatons. The word mega sounds pretty big, but it's only about 5% of Canada's total emissions, and Canada is only 2% of the world, so that's 0.1%. And anybody help me out with the math there? That's for the entire country, all 730 megatons, we could buy the carbons on the carbon exchange credit for about $35 million. So anyone who tells you you're going to get rich off of buying and selling carbon, it's not true. It's a tax, and maybe folks want to put more taxes on carbon. Didn't work for Stéphane Dion. I don't think it's going to work for Elizabeth. But how big is 30 to 35 megatons a year? There are individual coal-fired power plants in China, a single power plant, with more than 35 megatons. There is a power plant in Taiwan with 42 megatons. One plant. Every week in China, 2 to 3 new power plants are built. There are underground coal fires in coal mines in China, 360 megatons a year. By accident. They're just burning the coal by accident. They can't get the fires out. 360 megatons. In other words, an entire oil sands every month. But here's the great news. The oil sands is your carbon-friendly fuel. Because we don't flare our gas like they do in Nigeria or Iraq. We don't have super heavy oil like they do in Venezuela. You know what oil in California is called? There's a special name. California heavy. It's so viscous. If you care about carbon dioxide, then you should want to replace those higher carbon fuels that America imports with our lower carbon oil sands oil.
You're creative with your information, but according to the International Energy Agency, the tar sands crude is still the most carbon-intensive, dirty fuel in the world. The most recent numbers you can find from a very independent source. And the in-situ mining, which you refer to in your book almost as if it's going to be better because it doesn't require the completely gouging out down to 75 meters to do open pit strip mining to get the bitumen. The in situ is even more carbon intensive. Now, the reason that the spot check on the Chicago market shows a low price is that North America doesn't have any carbon pricing. So it hasn't actually created a market yet. The reason the OECD recommends that Canada should get in place a carbon tax is actually to protect the rest of our economy from the hollowing out that's created by Dutch disease from a petrodollar that is so volatile and now tied to a price of a barrel of oil, and having some really significant downward impacts. I mentioned the parliamentary committee. Let me just quote them. We have now seen a long-term structural change favoring both resource and service sectors at the expense of the manufacturing sector. That's because of the rapid expansion without proper planning in the tar sands. The result of that is the loss of really well-paying good jobs, and the hyperinflationary trends that are created in northern Alberta mean that even Alberta doesn't benefit as it should from its resource. The crude has to be piped down south of the border to the United States before anyone can afford, in the oil industry, to build a refinery. So the jobs are exported with the crude that's exported because we didn't take on board a planned management system. The most important thing we need to do, I mentioned subsidy, you're going to find I stick to the dollars a lot on this. Alberta has some of the world's lowest royalty rates. So the province of Alberta last year got more money from gambling and booze than it did from the tar sands. Meanwhile, Canada's federal taxpayers, you and I, continue to fork money over to some of the wealthiest countries in the world so that they can continue exploiting the tar sands. We now have advice, it's not just from Andrew Nikiforuk, although I think his thinking on this issue is very sound, but recently the C.D. Howe Institute this month came out with a report calling for a fund to set aside tar sands revenue, set it aside to stop the volatility of Alberta government revenue through the creation of the kind of long-term heritage fund that Norway had. Norway, of course, no longer has the volume. It's no longer in the top 10, but Norway managed to expand without developing Dutch disease because it took the money off the table. And that's why Norway now has a, $300 billion heritage fund, $380 billion Norway has in a heritage fund. And Alberta has $14 billion because when Ralph Klein came in, he canceled the whole enterprise. This is a serious conversation for Canadians to have. This is not a joke. This is very important to global energy supplies, and we ought to get it right in the interest of our economy and our environment.
I just want to touch on one fact. How do I say that Canadian oil sands oil has a lower carbon footprint than oil from California, Nigeria, or Iraq or Venezuela? I didn't say it. The Obama administration's Argonne National Labs has an analysis. They call it the GREET analysis, or the well-to-wheels analysis, or the full life cycle, from the moment you put the straw on the ground to the moment you turn your car. How much carbon dioxide is emitted. It takes into account everything. The super tankers to get the oil from Saudi, recycling the natural gas in cogeneration, flaring it in Iraq. So these are Obama administration analyses that say our oil sands are much lower than California heavy. You don't hear that when Nancy Pelosi comes up here because she's concerned about her California job. So she's sort of quiet about her heavy oil. Venezuela's heavier, and because they flare their gas in Nigeria and Iraq, they're heavier too. And by the way, 80% of the CO2 from a barrel of oil is when you guys turn your car on. Just saying. But you mentioned a good point, because only 2% of the land mass of the oil sands can be open pit mined. The rest is what you call SAGD, steam assisted gravity drainage. That's basically you stick a pipe underground, you steam the oil and you suck it up, but on top there's no excavation, there's still forests and critters and birds. And there's a new technology called TIE, total air injection. It doesn't use water at all. So in terms of water use, only 2% of the Athabasca River is allotted. The companies only use 1%, and that is reduced in periods of low flow. The new technologies use zero water. And this is that sort of self-critical, constant improvement that we as Canadians believe in. I can tell you they don't believe in that in Nigeria. 2,000 unremediated toxic oil spills that will never be cleaned up. But, you know, to me, the symbol of Alberta oil sands and our moral superiority of our oil versus the other customers, and I can wrap it up in 59 seconds, is the mayor of Fort McMurray, a young woman named Melissa Blake. Completely unremarkable to have a young woman mayor in Canada. How many young women mayors are there in Saudi Arabia? There are none. She's divorced, living with her fiancé, completely unremarkable. In Iran, that would be called adultery, and she'd be stoned to death under Sharia law. Now, do you care about that, or do you just care about the octane in your gas? Good news is oil sands octane is the same as Iranian octane. Ours is just morally better.
just quickly to say that the statistics I cited from the International Energy Agency included a well-to-wheels ratio that included all factors. It's true, California heavy comes close to the tar sands in situ. Meanwhile, again, the question shouldn't be whether we stone people in Canada, whether we're nicer in Canada. Yes, we are. And one of the things that makes us a good country to live in is respect for the rule of law. And one of the laws in this country is the Fisheries Act that says you can't be polluting the Athabasca River. And the fact that the Alberta government has not been pursuing the proper water regulations, I applaud former Environment Minister Jim Prentice for appointing a panel of scientists to look into the contamination of the Athabasca River. But these are serious issues. I've also cross-examined in my previous life when I was at Sierra Club, cross-examined officials from the Alberta government and found that when they allocate water from the Athabasca River to the mining companies, they never took into account what's happening as a result of the impact of the climate crisis, that the Athabasca River is already experiencing low water flows that are historically significant. In other words, outside of normal parameters, the Athabasca River is experiencing low flow conditions, and that the scientists who do freshwater research in this country are concerned about the amount of withdrawal of water. Again, back to the money. They don't pay for their water. It's another reason that they're developing in the tar sands. One of the lowest royalty rates in the world, taxpayer subsidies, getting the water nearly for free, and lax environmental regulation. If you want to be, to take a moral stance about our oil, I suggest that we do something about the fact that 54% of our oil imports come from these other countries. The failure of this country to have a national approach to our energy supplies, the fact that if the OPEC countries cut off Atlantic Canada, they have no access to Alberta oil because we never bothered figuring out whether we need a strategic petroleum reserve. We've done nothing to think as a country about our resources. We're so busy trying to develop the tar sands and ship the crude south to the U.S. as fast as we can that we've ignored the fact that this is a nation and this is a national question. How do we develop the tar sands? We can do it much better than we're doing it right now, and that's why we call for a moratorium.
It's true, we are a massive exporter of oil, but we do import at the same time. It's unusual, and it's because of how the industry grew up. For decades, it made more sense for refineries like the big Irving refinery in the Atlantic and in Montreal to import by tanker from the North Sea, and we actually import some oil in Canada from Algeria and even Saudi Arabia. Can you imagine that? We're importing oil from Saudi on the East Coast while we're shipping good Canadian moral oil to the States. You know what would solve that? Country of origin labeling. Every item of clothing you're wearing, everything you buy in a toy store, it says where it's made. And sometimes we don't care, but sometimes we care. Like, I would never buy baby food made in China. It's because sometimes information's valuable. If you had a gas pump, one said 87 octane, 89 octane, 91 octane, okay, you could make the choice. But what if one said made in Nigeria, made in Sudan, made in Iran, made in Canada? Where do you think our American allies would prefer to buy their oil from, given that it all costs the same? Well, where do you think our friends in Montreal and the Atlantic would prefer to buy their oil from? Canada or I think if we had country of origin labeling, we would empower consumers with that information, and that would put pressure up the system to the refiners to buy our good Canadian ethical oil. And you know what? I think a lot of, in a closing call, I was in Halifax 2 weeks ago at a packed house in Chapters. One guy stood up, he said, "I'm from Cape Breton." He was a union organizer. He said, in union jobs alone, $3 to $6 million a week net come into that community from the oil sands. When I was a kid, Cape Breton was synonymous with unemployment. This proud union member was saying that $3 to $6 million a week into Cape Breton. And Bill Romke stood up in the Senate last week and said there's some communities in Newfoundland, half their money comes from the oil sands. This is not just an Alberta miracle. This is a national unity miracle, a miracle of employment for good, hard-working Atlantic Canadians, and more Ontarians work for the oil sands than work for the big three automakers.
Yeah. Your country of origin labeling runs up against a certain problem when you have a federal government that doesn't have any plan or in any policy that allows the Alberta oil to do anything other than being hustled out to export. And now they want the pipeline to take it to Asia. There is no plan to have the infrastructure that would get the Alberta oil to Atlantic Canada. And coming from Atlantic Canada myself, if you think that this is a vision for a country to go from unemployment, but at least Dad was home, to families that don't see their fathers. I know it may sound like a small thing, and maybe you don't think it matters, but when I have women break down in tears because they don't get to have the breadwinner at home, this is the biggest commute that exists. This is a workplace commute by jet. And they jet in, they jet out. There's not a community in those work camps in outside the Athabasca tar sands. The community of Fort McMurray has grown dramatically without the infrastructure to meet their needs. You talk about Melissa Blake. Her mayor and council also called for a moratorium on development till the infrastructure could catch up. Meanwhile, there are an awful lot of families who'd rather have the manufacturing jobs and a chance for Canada's economy to diversify so that we can have jobs where people actually live, so that men can see their families. And I know for one thing, during the last election, I had one person say to me, she said, I think you're carrying all the votes in Fort McMurray because all the guys want jobs at home. They're not all that thrilled that the only jobs they can find are flying into the Athabasca oil sands instead of being able to have manufacturing jobs near where they live. And that takes national strategies.
You came in a close sixth place there.
Respond as you would. But I wanted to ask you to address yourself specifically, if you might, to this question of the degree to which Canadians are accruing sufficient benefit in taxes, royalties, jobs, and so on from the oil sands. And then I'll put it.
We are selling $100 million a day of oil sands oil to the States. Now, if you care about the liberal motto, think globally, act locally, that's $100 million a day not going to terrorists or dictators. But the families in Cape Breton, in Newfoundland, the largest employer of Aboriginal people in the country is the oil sands. If you care about working poor, and I know liberals do, if you're working poor, get yourself to Fort McMurray. The lowest quarter of income earners, let's call those the working poor, are 77% ahead, 77% more buying power in Fort McMurray than in cities like Edmonton. It is it's an economic miracle, and the most generous city in Canada too, according to the United Way. The amount of money that goes in contracts to manufacturers in Ontario. And these are real jobs. These aren't throwaway jobs to automakers that are being sold in fire sales to China. These are real jobs that are going to be here for 30 years. Canada would not have had surpluses under the Chrétien Martin years were it not for the oil sands. That's how much of a benefit it is to the federal government. Not just Alberta, but 5 other governments are $1 billion a year tax reapers from the oil sands. I don't know all the numbers off the top of my head, Terry, but I footnote them in the book. This is so big that it's made energy as big as banking on the TSX. If anyone here is a member of a teachers union, a police union, any public sector union, you are owners of oil sands from your pension fund because it's the best rate of return in the country, in the world. Ethical funds, final point. I examined every single ethical fund in Canada. I have a whole chapter on the book. What do they own? Every single ethical fund in Canada owns shares in the oil sands. Not just because it's a great rate of return, but because seriously, you're going to invest in Saudi Aramco instead?
All right.
Can I ask you, and do respond as you would, but I wanted to ask you to, if you would, more clearly address the similar sort of question. What would what kind of a paradigm in taxes and revenues and jobs do you foresee for the people of Alberta? And maybe both of you might address this when you get a chance, is what would a Canadian energy policy look like? And what perhaps shared ground might the both of you have on the question?
Okay. Let me just quickly, if I can, Terry, respond to a couple of things Ezra said in the last answer, and I'll just because I think it's important. Look, I had a really interesting roundtable with residents of Fort McMurray earlier this summer. The problems of homelessness are significant. It's very hard to afford an apartment there. People who are coming in who are new Canadians, families of 14 sharing a one-bedroom apartment. It's not an easy circumstance. There's a lot of money, it's true. So everything is skewed. In order to qualify for low-income housing in Fort McMurray, you have to earn $60,000 or less. They've got a problem in Fort McMurray. They get RCMP officers and teachers who come in and they quit their jobs to go drive a truck because they make so much more that it becomes hard to keep going as an RCMP officer or a school teacher. The economies are very skewed. Now, what would by the way, Dutch disease, one last statistic from some economists who studied it. The estimate is that for every job created in the tar sands, we lost another job somewhere else in Canada. So we've got to look as a country. What would a national energy strategy look like? I had a really interesting debate in, of all places, the Petroleum Club in Calgary. They put me up against two people there, Murray Smith, the former energy minister, and Deborah Yeldon from the Calgary Herald. And I actually got them to agree we needed a national energy strategy. We got those words out of their mouths, not with a P word, the plan word, but what would it look like? Let's start with taking the money off the table. Let's not let our dollar become a petrodollar. Let's not let our country become a petrostate where participation in democratic institutions falls. That's one of the things you see happening. Lowest turnout in any provincial election in this country was the 40% who voted in Alberta last time. And Fort McMurray shows the lowest voter turnout of any municipality in the country. Democratic engagement is important, and it actually has something to do with not allowing us to be a petrostate. Take the money off the table, set it aside. Tax regime, let's tax carbon and reduce income taxes as a result so we can replace taxes on people and on small business and on profit and put those taxes from pollution taxes instead. A national energy strategy would say before we export our oil, let's not be net importers. We are net importers of oil. 54% we import. Let's have a strategy that has maximum energy efficiency, has a commitment to move off oil, but to use it well while we're using it and to profit from it to the maximum extent possible for the nation as a whole, including Alberta, which one of the times during this debate in Calgary, I'm wrapping up Petroleum Club, when I called for the fact that what we should do to have Alberta take the lead on climate in this country is simple. Shut down all the coal plants in Alberta, which currently there's more carbon from the coal plants in Alberta than from the tar sands. That won't last long at the rate that they're building up the tar sands. But for now, shut down the coal plants, replace them with high-efficiency natural gas, which would have the effect of getting the natural gas sector somewhere to go because they're stalled. All of a sudden, all the oil and gas guys started applauding me till they became self-conscious when they realized they were applauding the leader of the Green Party.
I praised you, Elizabeth, at the beginning for becoming more moderate and more reasonable. I feel I have to rescind that now. Shut down the coal plants. Just do it. Hey guys, just shut down the coal plants. Just shut them down. Forget the jobs and forget the power too. And all those fellas, the thousands and thousands and thousands of men and women, families who over their kitchen table have decided that the best thing for their families in Gander and Twillingate and St. John's and all of these towns is, for their husband to go away for 20 days and then come back for 10. These families have made the personal decision that the best thing for them is to go work for the oil sands. But Elizabeth knows better. Families who maybe for 400 years have waved goodbye to their husbands as they went out to sea for a week, have now waved goodbye to the husband, but instead of bringing back 35 grand a year, he's bringing back 135 a year. You know what? It's a little bit of chutzpah. It's a little bit of chutzpah for you to tell those families you know what's better for them. I would never do that.
I've never told families what's better for them. They've come to me in tears, wishing that they did not have to make those kinds of choices. Those were families and communities that have some of the strongest community spirit you've ever seen. And maybe you think it's fine to have a family where the father is gone and not part of their children's growing up. But I don't think that reflects what I thought conservative values were supposed to be about. And I also think heckling is not appreciated. Let me just explain what I think a modicum of respect is helpful, and the reality of
Just settle down. There's going to be questions and answers in a moment, so everyone just calm down. Go ahead.
I mean, this is a sensitive topic, how families feel about having to have jobs that are thousands and thousands of miles away from the family. But I don't think it's healthy, and neither do most of the families who have to go through this. You come home with a new truck. I got a neighbor in Marguerite. He's a great guy. He comes home and he flies the Suncorps flag in front of his house. He never got married. He's never had a family. He's lived all his life ever since he was a teenager and dropped out of high school to go to the tar sands. It's not really a dream future.
Okay, I'm going to give you a
question. When I was a kid, Cape Breton was synonymous with unemployment. All I heard about was a new program to make an uneconomic coal mine, by the way, high carbon, last for a little longer even though there's no money in it. Or maybe it would be a new tags program, you know, catch a couple of cod. It's not just the financial weakness. When a man who wants to work hard can't work hard, there's something morally and spiritually corrosive about that. These are men who work so hard and earn so much money and provide for their families. To question the morality of that family, and it's not just the men. A woman who a bed and breakfast I stayed at, by summer, she runs a bed and breakfast. In the wintertime when tourism is down, she goes and cooks for a work camp in Grand Prairie at $40 an hour. What pays $40 an hour in Twillingate other than maybe the doctor?
Can I just say again, the choices that are being made for families are their choices, and I respect their choices. They have come to me over and over again, saddened by the fact that they don't seem to have that national picture that creates national jobs. We could get into why the cod stocks collapsed. It had a lot to do with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. It didn't have to do with the fishermen who are now without the livelihood that they've known for hundreds of years. And yes, if you have to find a job somewhere, I certainly respect the dads who go and make these choices, but I know how much they regret them because they tell me, because I'm from that part of the world. And I never said you'd close down the coal plants and not replace them. Close down the coal plants and replace them with high efficiency natural gas plants that would help get the natural gas sector going, which, as you know, is currently stalled in Alberta. We should take the billions of dollars which we're now sinking into carbon capture and storage, which is not at this point shown to be economical at all. I'm not against research into it, but there's loads of countries around the world doing more cutting-edge research than we're doing it. That's another taxpayer disguised subsidy to the tar sands. Let's take that money and find and replace coal-fired power plants across this country as expeditiously and as quickly as possible. That will put us in the lead globally and really make a difference. Now, did you want me to address the question about Dutch disease now?
In fact, you both might, if you like. It's just a question about...
It's just a factual point, just to explain. It's an economist term. It comes from the experience of the Netherlands in the 1970s when they found offshore natural gas. They started going so hell-bent for leather into those deposits that the Dutch guilder started to become tied to the value of a barrel of oil, and the Dutch guilder rose in value, and the manufacturing sector began to collapse. As a result, it's called Dutch disease, and economists generally warn you not to fall into that when you're exploiting your resource revenues.
If Ezra wants to weigh in on Dutch disease, I'll give him a freebie.
The United States unemployment rate is just a touch under 10%. Ours is 8%. Our economy is growing, theirs isn't. If our dollar truly was as tied to oil as it was in some of those other countries, you would expect our dollar to have plummeted. Because remember, oil hit about $140, and now it's only 80. You'd think if we truly had that Dutch disease, our dollar would only be worth about 50 cents now. We have some tie to commodities, of course, gold too. But to say that we are some petro state, and you actually tried to make the link to people not voting because of oil, I think that's a little kooky. Sorry.
What we're going to do now...
This is, if I can just clarify, someone over here heckled lefty economists. If anyone thinks the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is left-wing, I think you really need to go look at what that organization... It is all the industrialized countries in what is generally seen as a very conservative agency of the industrialized world, and that's just one of the sources of economists I've mentioned tonight.
Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to go to question and answers and try to keep everybody likes to make a little bit of a comment before they ask their question. That's fine. Try to keep it as brief as you possibly can. And then we're going to go to closing statements from both Ezra and Elizabeth. So why don't we start with this gentleman on the left, my left.
Okay, well, like there's a lot of talk about the oil sands being bad, like the tail-end spawns, for instance. You know, Syncrude was crucified over a couple ducks landing there and dying there, but then somehow we seem to forget that, one, windmills have a habit of disrupting the migration patterns of many birds. Our skyscrapers and other buildings that we built, I guess, a plague of our progress. They have hundreds and hundreds of birds all crash into them
and
every
your question would be?
Again, the question. Like I was at, there are efforts. I wonder if you have any efforts that have been made to, for instance, remove the tailing spawns as they stand there in the oil sands, and also and find some other use for them. Like I know there's a project there that takes the water out and sells
Could you get to your question, please? Thanks.
Yeah. I said, you have any projects that work towards removing the water and support and pretty much clean up the tailing spawns and making them better?
The new technologies, the SAGD or underground or the TIE underground, don't have tailings ponds. The tailings ponds are a problem, as they are with every other mine around the world. Let's just put things in a context, though. 230 ducks died a couple weeks ago. Has anyone here on Wings Night ever had 100 wings in one sitting? That's 50 chickens worth. I've had almost 100 wings in one sitting. Anyone here, in the first month the KFC had its double down, they sold 300,000 of those. In Alberta last year, about 140,000 ducks were shot by good old boys. I have seen birds, unfortunately, fly into my murdering parents' window. And look, it's bad when ducks die by accident. We kill a lot of ducks on purpose. Obviously, accidents shouldn't happen, but if you measure the ducks dying per kilowatt hour, you should favor oil sands over those big blenders we call wind turbines.
The tailing ponds represent a significant problem. They currently cover more than 170 square kilometers in Alberta. The man-made impoundments to hold them back are some of the largest man-made structures on Earth. You can see them from outer space. One pond alone, run by Syncrude, is 13 square kilometers. We have a real problem because these naturally look like lakes where ducks are used to landing. And it's not illegal to eat double-down KFC food. It is illegal in this country to kill migratory waterfowl through poisoned tailings ponds. This is actually under the laws of this country to protect migratory birds. And as a result, this is why there have been charges laid and why the company has had to pay fines. The problem is not going to be solved until they change the technology. And in answer to your question, I know of no current plans to deal with the fact that we have 170 square kilometers of toxic what look to migratory waterfowl as they approach, safe place to land, but emerge as death traps. That's a problem that the industry is going to have to solve.
Thank you. I have a brief question. I have a yes/no question for Elizabeth May and another question for Ezra.